Hello friends, and welcome to my today's lecture, that is the second part of the themes in Wallace Stevens' poetry of modern poetry. In my last lecture, I had spoken about the various themes that Wallace Stevens deals with in his poem of modern poetry. Among them, the major themes being old poetry versus modern poetry, meaning amid chaos, the human mind, ordinary people, sympathy and emotional peace, realism in poetry, and many more themes like literature, spiritualism, etc. I had also explained in detail the first two themes, that is old poetry versus modern poetry, and meaning amid chaos. Now, in the old poetry versus modern poetry, I had mentioned that the title had been kept with a very special reason, the very first few lines gives us the clue as to differentiating the modern poetry, that is the poetry of the 20th century, from what came before. And I had also mentioned that according to Stevens, the new way was basically to look within the mind itself and cultivate the human powers of perception and creativity. Before that, I had also mentioned that as a part of the struggle of the modern poets, the theatre was changed because of the industrial growth, the growth and development of technology, and also the havoc created by the world wars, the pastoral odes, and the saccharine love sonnets, which no longer had the same impact as it had in the earlier days. I had mentioned that the of modern poetry follows the technique of looking within the mind itself, and also steps into a more outward looking mode temporarily and a bit more socially conscious. Now, in the second theme of meaning amid chaos, I had mentioned the main purpose of poetry. The main purpose of poetry, according to this poem of modern poetry, was to find meaning and order out of chaos, and to provide the readers with something correct or right, something true to which they could hold on. And I had also mentioned that towards the end, when we come, it is there, it must be the finding of satisfaction, towards the end, which is mentioned, finding of satisfaction, which is actually the main purpose the poetry must serve. And the poetry is like a musician whose instrument gives a sudden rightness and clarity to whatever sound that passes through it. And this satisfaction that has been mentioned, this satisfaction is basically that the poetry offers, it is going to be universal. Today I'll be talking the few remaining themes. On the third place, I will talk about the human mind as being the major theme of modern poetry. Now, this poem of modern poetry, it asserts Stevens' belief in the supreme importance of the human mind, and it does it in a very sensitive way than many other earlier works if viewed in that sense. Now, the many poems like the snowman and the idea of order at Key West had asserted the power of mind to create. But this poem of modern poetry asserts that it is the duty of poetry to meet the demands of the mind, the need for emotional and mental clarity. As we read through the poem, the very first line we see that it tells us that a poem must reflect the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. That is, in the act of finding enough meaning and hope to make life worthwhile. Now, it echoes the sentiment that the poem must tell the audience, in quotes, what it wants to hear, unquote. Now, Stevens longs for such a poem which can completely contain or control the mind, and thus it does not descend or stoop down or rise beyond the level of mind. And it also emphasizes or stresses the importance of poetry as a vessel for the needs and struggles of the human mind as we seek meaning and satisfaction in life. Now, on the fourth place is the ordinary people, which Stevens talks about in the poem. And Stevens says that one of the major duties of the poetry is to also take into notice the normal human being or the ordinary people. That is, the in quotes, as he has mentioned, the men of today and the women of today. Or women of time, the men of time and the women of time. The poem suggests that everybody has some or the other worthwhile or meaningful quality in him, and an effective poet must mix with the people around him. He should mingle with them easily. Now, the critic Mark Halliday, reviewing Stevens' poetry, has remarked that as compared to Stevens' other works, this poem of modern poetry this poem encourages definitely concerning the in quotes interpersonal human relationships, and also that some part of this emotional and physical investment that is put in, it can be paid off in one's everyday community, and it may be conveyed in the poems as is conveyed in the poem's last few lines, common satisfaction, in quotes. Now, it can be found in simple actions. This common satisfaction can be found in simple actions of the individual, such as skating or dancing and so on. Another theme that Stevens talks about in his poem of modern poetry is sympathy and emotional peace. Now, when we read through the middle section of the poem, which reads, in quotes, an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. Now, we see that the best effect of modern poem is that the members of the audience, they listen to themselves and they experience this emotion, either of the two people or of two emotions uniting to become one. Now, this image suggests an emotionally reconciling peace, uniting or bringing together the two opposite emotions within oneself, and also bringing the emotions of two persons together. Now, if we view it on a basic etymological level, we see that sympathy means feeling together. And it is perhaps the best way to describe the experience that the audience will have according to Stevens, in which they can feel and sense each other through their humanity, or feeling of humanness. Now it is termed as, in quotes we can say, imaginative sympathy by critic David Walker. Now such an emotion would have seemed important or necessary to the American readers in 1942, some bleakest moments of the World War II. Now, another theme that I could talk about of the poem of modern poetry is realism. Now, as Stevens puts it, or he states that it is a job of poetry to be realistic and honest about the world and not being false and escapist, together with giving emotional clarity and meaning to the audience. Initially, it is done by accepting or acknowledging that the theatre of poetry has changed, and one cannot always please or appease the readers with old-fashioned verses. Moreover, now the poetry, in quotes, has to think of war, as is mentioned in the poem, especially the two world wars which have occurred since the modernists started writing poetry, and also be very practical about the evil and darkness which they signify and portray. Now, more themes of modern poetry poem by Wallace Stevens I'll be talking about in my next lecture. Till then, goodbye and thank you, friends.